So my guess is most of us have heard about 63 sermons in our lifetimes on the Good Samaritan. Yeah, and my guess is between Neil and Nancy and me, we've preached about 163 sermons on the Good Samaritan. But what I appreciate is that Dr. Amy Jill A.J. Levine, who's an Orthodox Jew who teaches the New Testament at Vanderbilt Divinity School, brought some new ideas to this parable, and I want to share them with you as part of this sermon. Well, Mr. Rogers was a man of great wisdom. After the 9/11 tragedy, I was looking for a way to talk about the 9/11 tragedy during a children's time. I didn't want to downplay the seriousness and fear associated with the attacks, but I did want to offer hope to the children who were just as upset as the adults in their lives. Everybody had watched way too much television. Everybody had watched way too many commentaries about the fear that we faced. Everybody had seen enough of the buildings falling and collapsing over and over and over, and our children were as upset as the adults. Well, Mr. Rogers came through with one of his lessons on disasters and danger. He told the story about how his mother taught him to look for helpers. When scary news was on or a catastrophe took place, his mother told Mr. Rogers to always look for the helpers, and she assured him that there always would be helpers. And on that day of that tragedy, there were a lot of helpers who went. And the children, I think, found some comfort, as did I. Well, Jesus told a story about a catastrophe that happened to one particular man. He was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, which was a road going down the hill, filled with winds and twists and turns, a perfect place for robbers to come and attack him, where they stripped him, beat him, and left him for dead. A priest was going down to Jericho, saw the man, and passed by on the other side of the road. A Levite was also taking the same journey. He saw the man. He also got as far away as he could and went down the other side of the road. Now at this point, everybody listening to Jesus would have expected him to say the next person coming down the road was an Israelite. It's kind of when I say red and white, you say blue. When I say red and white, you say
Badgers.
Blue. Badgers. Or the Ohio State, yes. Or Nebraska. But yeah, red and white, we say blue. Well, in this case, people in those days would have said, okay, priest, Levite, Israelite. It was the threesome everybody was used to. And so everybody was sure the next person coming down the road would have been an Israelite. Instead, Jesus said the next person coming down the road was a Samaritan. Well, that would have been like saying a priest, a Levite, and Satan. Because in those days, Samaritans were absolutely despised. They were hated. And not only that, Samaritans hated people, the Israelites, just as much as the Israelites hated Samaritans. It was oil and water. They did not mix. They tried to avoid each other at every cost. And still, when the Samaritans saw the man lying beaten, bloody, and possibly dead, he's the one who went to help. People were shocked. They needed to know more. They needed to know what was going on. And so Jesus said the Samaritan stopped, tended the man's wounds, and then he loaded the man on his own donkey and took him to the closest inn. The Samaritan left a lot of money so the inntaker would take care of him, and then to make sure that the inntaker just didn't pocket the money and leave the guy in a room on his own, he said, and when I come back, meaning I will be checking up on you, when I come back I'll pay you anything else that you need. When Jesus asked who was the injured man's neighbor, the lawyer who had prompted the story couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. Instead he said, well, the one who helped. Samaritans were despised by the Jews, and yet they were the hero of the story. They helped when absolutely no one else would. Now, just as an aside, I've always excused the priest and the Levite from not helping because of the law in Judaism that forbade the priest and the Levite, or any good Jew, from touching somebody that might be a corpse, from getting involved in other people's blood and icky stuff. Well, they had no excuse because they weren't going up to Jerusalem to the temple to perform sacred duties. They were going down from the temple to Jerusalem and would have had absolutely no reason to be ritually clean. They just didn't want to help. They passed by on the other side. That was kind of hard to accept. Now, we have reason to believe that the injured man survived the attack, and we don't know what his reaction would have been when he realized that a much despised, evil other Samaritan was the one who helped him. Well, what would be our reaction if someone we absolutely despised reached out to help us when nobody else would? The question becomes, who is the Samaritan in our lives? Who is the evil other in our lives? Who would we not want to help us, and who would we not want to help? When we look for the helpers, who do we look for? When someone else needs help, do we stop and help, or do we find a reason to walk by on the other side? Now, Jesus, a devout Orthodox Jew who grew up being taught to hate Samaritans, found a way to travel through to Samaria several times during his journeys. He even stopped to talk with Samaritans. He offered his help, his hope, his healing, and his redeeming power to Samaritans. He even made a Samaritan the hero of this particular story. And it's highly possible that Jesus absolutely refused to think of Samaritans as the despised, evil others. It's actually possible that Jesus believed Samaritans were as loved by God as the Jews that he grew up to believe were the chosen ones. When we think about the evil other in our lives, and everybody just stop a minute and picture that evil other in our minds. Who's that evil other that we just wouldn't want to help, or we wouldn't want to help us? It's often hard to think of them as our helpers. Who in our lives would we not want to stop and help us, even if we were laying in the ditch, broken and bleeding? Would we accept help from an ex-significant other? Or would we just assume that one walked on by? Would we want help from an undocumented immigrant? Or would we just as soon wish they walked by or went back where they came from? Would we accept help from a terrorist? Would we accept help from someone who did not speak our language? When we think about helping others, it becomes a bit trickier. For in this day and age, we're warned away from helping strangers for fear that they're setting us up for attack. Anybody read Facebook? On Facebook? How often do we see the warnings? If this happens, don't stop. If this happens, go directly to the police station. And a lot of it's involved with an accident where somebody claims to be injured. Well, by the way, using injury to set others up for attack was nothing new. It was one of the techniques that happened a lot on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. The technique for treachery, the idea of kidnapping people, using an accident to kidnap people for human trafficking, that's not new either. The same methods were used in first century Israel, often on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. But Jesus did not offer absolution to those who did not help. Instead, he said the one who did help was the real neighbor. The neighbors we love as much as we love ourselves, as much as God loves us. So the question becomes, when will we help, and who will we help? Who in our lives would we rather walk past than stop to help? Who would we just as soon walk past us rather than stop to help us? Who's the Samaritan or the evil other we would just as soon let die rather than reach out to help? Who do we despise so much that we would rather suffer than request their help? And those are hard questions to answer because they require that we be incredibly honest with ourselves. And sometimes that honesty is painful because it asks us to look at a part of ourselves that we don't like to think about very much. that part of ourselves that truly believes some people are not loved by God as much as we are, which flies in the face of everything Jesus taught us. Those are hard questions to answer because we all have people or groups of people in our lives that we despise. And if we can't admit that we actually despise them, that we think aren't quite as good as we are. Not quite as worthy of God's love as we are. We all have fears that cause us to walk by or drive by. We all have reasons for not helping. We all have reasons for not accepting help. And Jesus knew we all had reasons. The priest and the Levite probably had their reasons, not the reasons we thought, but they had reasons. However, Jesus was quite sure that the priest and the Levite had no excuse. Do we? Nancy Dvorak just gave me this verse before the sermon. She must have known where it was heading. It's a quote from Thomas Merton, who said, "We are called to love others without first determining whether they are worthy." Well, doesn't that just stink? Because it'd be so much easier to determine who is deserving of our help and who deserves to help us. But that's not the way Jesus told the story. Now, Jesus didn't tell the story as a prescription. He told it to the people who were listening then, as he tells it to us now, as a point of discussion, a point to cause people to look at their own lives and their own actions, their own likes and their own dislikes. He told it to people to get them to think about their attitudes and whether they would have stopped. The Samaritan stopped. The people we would expect to stop didn't. When disaster strikes, we can look for the helpers. When scary news is on television, or when our computers tell us that disaster's coming, we can look for helpers. When catastrophe occurs, we can look for helpers, because the helpers are our neighbors. When we see someone needing help, we've been taught to drive by or to walk by, haven't we? People in the first century had the same reasons not to stop. We can walk by or we can help. We can ignore the pain in our midst, or we can be a neighbor to those who need help. Who's our neighbor? We live in a world that is hurt and bruised and bleeding. We live among people who are hurt and bruised and bleeding. The one who helps is the neighbor. Amen.
Amen.